We're back. We're live here at the 3 o'clock block on a given Thursday right after Christmas. This is Think Tech Talks, Community Matters. That's a double entendre. With Ethan Allen, who is the Director of STEM, Science, Technology, Education, and Math for PREL, Pacific Resources for Education and Learning, right here in the Pioneer Plaza building, where we have known them for 10 years plus here at Think Tech. And we're calling this show New Moves for PREL. Is that okay?
Okay.
So Ethan, tell us what it's like to be the Director of Education, of STEM Education at PREL.
Well, it's very exciting, Jay. Thank you. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to come down and visit here. PREL is at a very interesting time in its history. It's a rather long history, and science, technology, engineering, and mathematics are a fascinating set of fields that are moving very rapidly. Your last show with the drones was a real example of how all those four things all come together in a very lively way and are moving ahead and changing very, very quickly. So we need help work with children, but adults too, and be sure people catch up and stay current with STEM and learn about STEM in all its sort of exciting glory to really be prepared for all the challenges that are coming up in the world.
Oh yes, absolutely. So PREL, what is PREL? How long has it existed? What is its mission? What is its coverage right now?
So PREL is a nonprofit organization, a private nonprofit 501c3. It's been around for about 21, 22 years now. Used to be for a long time one of the so-called regional education laboratories. That's where the REL part of it comes. And basically PREL's mission is enhancing community well-being through partnerships in education. And that, in a sense, really says what it is we do. We work very closely, very collaboratively with groups throughout the whole U.S. affiliated Pacific Islands, so the state of Hawaii, the 3 territories, and then the 3 freely associated states. It's actually sort of 11 different jurisdictions all told on very broadly defined education projects. So some of it works directly with the state education agencies on school matters. Some of it we deal with things like principal leadership training and working with education leadership. We do things with helping them look at issues of, for instance, dual language. It's a real issue in the region. They try to do a lot of their school teaching in English only and leave a lot of the indigenous languages out of the education system, and that really weakens the students and the culture both. So we're trying to get that back in. And of course, we do a bunch of STEM now. So that's where I try to come in and play a role.
Now, what do you bring to that? You're a scientist, aren't you?
I have a sort of a fairly broad background, right? I was trained as a neuroscientist. I actually spent 6 years of my life training fish. We were investigating a laboratory to see if these fish had color vision, and so I trained my fish to approach illuminated targets and would make these targets of different colors and all. Yes. Oh yeah, fish are very bright. They actually learn very quickly, and were very good subjects. So that was very interesting work. I then worked for a while on other aspects of developing visual systems and how the visual system actually learns to see and shapes itself depending upon what its environment is. Took a little sort of side trip into an old love of mine of reptiles and studied reptile reproduction and all the sort of strange games that some snakes and lizards play with reproducing themselves, with temperature-dependent sex determination.
The sex life of a lizard, eh?
Right. Parthenogenetic species, all unisexual, clonal female species, and
that's exciting stuff. We should do another show on that, Ethan.
We could. There's a lot of stories to be told about that. But mostly I've really spent my career in science education. I started out in the informal sector working for the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago, helping them develop exhibits. And so your big challenge is how do you engage a very broad public in a topic of science or engineering.
This is a challenge.
Right. You can't use a lot of big fancy words. You've got to have stuff that's visually appealing, that grabs people, gets them to spend time looking at it, manipulating objects.
Even if they have no good background in the area.
Right. I mean, you're dealing with everything from 4-year-old kids to 65-year-old physicists, and you've got to somehow be able to entertain and engage them all. So that's very interesting work to do, and I really like the informal sector for its taking on that challenge. I then spent some time working with a nonprofit group, the Teachers Academy for Mathematics and Science in Chicago. That was a separate organization solely dedicated to improving science and mathematics teaching in Chicago public schools. At that point, really desperately needed a good outside focus on that. We did a lot of great work with them. I went off and did similar kinds of work in Seattle, where we get sort of what they call systemic reform. We get whole districts and groups of districts all focused together, working on how to build better science programs, improve their science and mathematics teaching and learning. It was great to sort of see these groups start to collaborate with one another and teach each other and begin to learn. And I've also worked at universities. Before I came here to Hawaii, I was with the Center for Nanotechnology at the University of Washington, doing everything from working with their doctoral students on a nanotech PhD program to working with groups of school kids and all, and showing them sort of what nanotechnology all is. So I've done a variety of different kinds of things across the years, and really enjoy being here in Hawaii, working out in the region. A lot of very interesting challenges for science.
Certainly, you've evolved from, being a research scientist to being a science educator person.
Yes.
And that's where you are now. And it sounds like to me you've crossed the Rubicon on that. That's where you're going to stay.
I think so. It'd be very hard to go back into pure research at this point. I think there's a certain type of mind that's drawn to research. And I think early on I discovered more of my interests are out in the communication of science and helping show people that science is this fun, appealing, engaging
That's great.
Subject.
That's great. Well, I'd like to just refer for a moment, since you mentioned the museum in Chicago, to the Boston Museum of Science, which is really, I haven't been there, but one of the guys on one of the boards that I sit, has been there, and he's a director of that museum, and he'd like to see that museum, put its footprint elsewhere as well. And I met the executive who runs the museum in Boston. And he is a strong national figure in exactly what you're talking about. I forget his name. He's a Greek fellow, and he delivers science everywhere through the auspices of the museum. The museum itself becomes an educational institution. And with outreach all around the country, actually. And I think there's a parallel here somewhere, because science education is not limited to the schools. For that matter, it's not limited to the museums. It's anywhere and it's everywhere you can find it. And the notion is to inculcate it, throughout our society, everywhere. And that way, everybody, not only kids, but everybody will have an awareness. That's what you're doing, isn't it?
Exactly. And places like the Bishop Museum here very much push that same model. And I'm working currently on a National Science Foundation funded project through their informal science education group to do that out in COOKE and Yap states of Micronesia, as well as in the Marshall Islands and Palau. And those areas have a real challenge because they have no informal science infrastructure. There are virtually no museums, no science centers, no zoos, no aquaria, no botanic gardens, none of that stuff where we sort of take it for granted that you can hop in your car and drive to someplace and get your kid a fun science experience. There's nothing like that there, so we're trying to sort of bootstrap all that into existence, while also actually using the subject of drinking water, which is so crucial out in the islands, as sort of a topic to really engage whole communities in learning about science.
So it's really an interesting comparison. I was going to ask you, and we'll migrate to the Pacific Islands in a minute. I was going to ask you how you felt STEM was doing in this country. Because, education not doing all that well, including Hawaii not doing all that well. And yet, China is, very good on science education and better every day. And those kids have a huge advantage when they come here and go into our graduate schools. I'm sure you know a lot of Chinese kids and people. but I'm wondering how you feel, how successful has it been, this national initiative to teach STEM to our kids?
There's a lot of work to be done there. Science got a sort of a bad rap somewhere along the line, I think, for being a subject only for geeks, for being something that's done in the laboratory by older white guys with crazy hair and wild eyes and wearing white lab coats, and that's sort of the stereotype image of scientists. And it's not like that at all. You know, science is in use every day. When you go and flick on a light switch and the light doesn't come on, you go through a process of thinking about why that is, and you do experiments. You change the bulb, you look at the switch, you open it up. You know, there's different kinds of things you do. You approach it in a very scientific way because that's the sensible, it's the best problem-solving sort of method we have at our disposal. So people need to sort of understand that much more. And I don't think we've been very successful at it. The science literacy is really abysmal, quite frankly, in this country. Surprising numbers of people graduate, even from our finest institutions of higher learning, with remarkable gaps in their science knowledge. No real sense of very basic phenomena. There have been lovely video programs done, this Minds of Our Own, a whole series of videos filmed at Harvard and MIT dealing with their graduates, asking them simple questions like why it's warmer in the summer and colder in the winter, and watching graduate after graduate answer it incorrectly, being quite sure they're absolutely right. Oh, it's because the Earth is closer to the sun in the summer and further away in the winter. Just sort of things you would have thought they would have picked up in 5th grade or 7th grade, or certainly somewhere. Here they've graduated from these fine institutions and can't do it. So it's no, there's some real challenges, and particularly out here in the islands, where I think there's a real need for a better qualified teaching workforce in STEM. So that the kids don't have a lot of good role models to work with.
Yeah. Well, you know, it's interesting. I mean, there's two kinds of science these days. One is the kind of science you have in your life every day, like you're on your iPad. That's not really science at all, by the way. That's consumer, totally consumer. And the other part is understanding why it's hotter in the winter and in the summer than in winter, and understanding climate change, and understanding all the physical forces around us and what makes things tick. I mean, things maybe that we learned since the 18th century. and it's fairly remarkable that people see science as consumer science.
Right.
And if they know how the iPad works, that's it. That's all they need to know. It's really very shallow. And you know, we have all these standards of education. We have curricula. You know, all around the country, we have the federal government telling us what they're going to support in the schools, what they're going to pay for in the schools. Isn't this something that could be handled by you know, some deft maneuvering by the federal government in the way it arranges the curricula?
Well, that's actually a fairly radical idea that you have. I quite frankly sort of share your opinion that having 16,000 local school boards probably isn't the world's best solution to having a well-educated populace.
Some of them don't like to teach Darwin.
Right,
You know?
exactly. But you're quite right. Also, there's a tremendous wealth of science knowledge out there. In the islands here, for instance, people have understood about weather prediction for generations and can tell from the way the clouds are forming and the waves are breaking and the currents are moving what's going to happen when they need to make preparations for storms. They can navigate over vast distances of the ocean without any instrumentation other than these so-called stick chart compasses.
Yeah, I love that kind of science. That's really earthy.
Right, and so we've got to bring that on into the Western science too, while helping prepare these countries and these people for moving from these they're fairly isolated existence. And only a few decades ago, lots of these places were very, very isolated. The people living there would rarely see outsiders at all. And now they're in the 21st century. You know, they're getting iPhones and iPads, and they can be in touch with anyone in the world instantly. And that's got to be a tough transition for the governments there to manage, education systems, and these groups to manage.
Oh, I want to talk to you about that. Yeah. We'll take a short break, though, right now. This is Ethan Allen. He's the STEM director of PREL, the Pacific Resources for Education and Learning, right here in Pioneer Plaza. And we're Think Tech Talks, doing community matters, new moves for PREL today. We'll be right back after this break.
We want to thank our underwriters.
Hawaiian Electric Company and its affiliates Maui Electric on Maui and Hawaii Electric Light Company on Hawaii Island are deeply committed to the communities they serve.
Galen Ho is a senior executive of BAE Systems, a global defense, security, and aerospace company.
The High-Tech Development Corporation, the state's leading technology agency, attached to the Department of Business, Economic Development, and Tourism.
Castle in COOKE, Hawaii, with a time-honored legacy that spans more than 160 years and revolves around its mission of investing in Hawaii, creating communities, and providing for the needs of our state.
Hawaii Gas, formerly the gas company, a proponent of the Liquefied Natural Gas Initiative, helping Hawaii achieve its transition to clean energy and a better energy future.
Collateral Analytics, a Hawaii-based tech company empowering the real estate industry with greater and faster access to the tools and data they need to make better informed property investment decisions.
I'm Nicole Hori. Thanks so much for joining us on Think Tech.
I'm Maria Kashem. See you next time.
We're back, we're live, we're Think Tech Talks. I'm Jay Fidell. We're talking about community matters. That's a double entendre. We're talking about new moves for PREL, Pacific Resources for Education and Learning, right here with us in the Pioneer Plaza building. Ethan Allen is my guest today, and he is the Director of STEM, Science, Technology, Education, and Math at PREL. And wow, what an expansive job you have. You know, your area is as big as all outdoors. It covers, you know, tens of millions of miles, and you get to see all these islands that the last time we heard about them was in Michener's book, or maybe War at Sea. Remember War at Sea? So, I guess I'd like to open this discussion, Ethan, by asking you, you know, what is going on with the Pacific Islands? In a sort of in a larger geopolitical sense. They were very important in World War II. I don't think they'd been important. I think they gathered importance after the Spanish-American War, and maybe, you know, were not that important in World War II. And then in World War II, they got to be very important because there was a battle on a lot of them. And then after World War II, it kind of died down and became backwater, and here we are.
Right, and now they're really regaining importance again for a variety of different reasons. But the whole Pacific Rim, of course, is a hotbed of trade these days, from the west coast of the U.S. to Japan and other parts of Asia and all. And these islands sort of sit right in the center of all of that, and so are logical transit points. They are very small islands with very few people. And yes, since World War II, lots of them have basically been left alone to sit quietly and bask in the sun and do little else. They now have more and more are seen as, you know, vital parts of the 21st century global economy. How are they moving cultures into that whole new economic model literally from sort of agrarian, very, very low-key, very isolated modes of living. That's a tremendous burden to place on any culture. They're doing this in the face of really rapid changes, unprecedented changes in terms of climate variability, more different kinds of storm surges, rising sea levels, which particularly for the low islands like the Marshalls are just devastating. When the high point in your country is 10 feet above sea level, and the sea level rises at all, you lose big chunks of your country. So there's all kinds of interesting issues that these cultures are facing, and we want to try to work with them. And each one has its own sort of unique set of challenges, but these cultures should be maintained. They've been around for thousands of years. They're facing sort of a crisis, in a sense, in many of these areas. I'll use the Marshalls again. The children growing up there today are not going to live their lives in the Marshalls in many, many cases. Much of the Marshall Islands will be gone within the next 50 to 60 years.
Talk about a brain drain. It's a total drain.
Or uninhabitable, right? There'll be huge global issues as some of these countries literally go underwater and disappear off the face of the earth. And what do you do with a country that no longer is a country, that no longer exists? Kiribati is actually apparently putting in old oil rigs by their islands. They're going to sort of keep a footprint and be able to say this is our space, just to deal with that kind of issue. But how do you relocate your populations? How do you maintain a culture in the face of a small population being dispersed across the face of the earth? You know?
Well, you know, in World War II, we watched South Pacific and Bloody Mary and all that, and it was ours. We adopted a lot of these places. You know, I mean, up to and after South Pacific and World War II. And it was funny. It's like if you adopt a place, then you become responsible for the place. And they're all our progeny somehow. They're all part of our national thing. So we do have a connection with them, historical and otherwise, and we have an obligation, don't you think?
Absolutely, and we've certainly done some wonderful things for parts of them. We've also done some, unfortunately, very bad things, and it's truly one of the areas I mentioned it earlier. It is in the education system, where wholesale these countries adopted English as the language of school, and they essentially insist that all teaching past second or third grade typically be done in English. Mm-hmm. And what this meant was that you had non-native English speakers teaching English to non-native English-speaking students. And particularly if the teachers have not been well trained in English, this gets to be a horrible thing in science. How do you explain quantum mechanics in a language that you don't know to students who don't speak that language either? It's set up for failure. We're trying now to work with them to help set up dual language programs and say take advantage of the strengths and beauty and power of your own language and have English track right side by side with it. And so we try to produce educational materials often in both languages. So we'll have the same text side by side so students can begin to really understand.
So you retain value in the culture.
Absolutely. These cultures have tremendous knowledge, and it'll be a rotten shame to lose it. It'd be a travesty.
But let me ask you though, Ethan, we are losing it, aren't we? I mean, there's a trend here. There's a trajectory. It's not a hopeful thing.
We are. There are signs of hope. I mean, there are whole Micronesian communities now in Arkansas, for instance. Where groups of Micronesians moved and have settled.
And they have a right to go. They have the right to enter the country without papers and all that.
Right, because of the Compacts of Free Association, mm-hmm. Exactly. And it's great. I mean, there's new challenges. Certainly, the Arkansas teachers aren't ready to deal with Micronesian students and had all kinds of issues and challenges and problems. But there are hopeful signs in that sense. But yes, there are challenges. Some of the smaller outlying islands are doubtless going to essentially disappear. They're going to lose all their speakers of these languages. They're going to die away. Hopefully, at least some of them will survive. We're trying to work with the local groups to record stuff, to interview elders, document their accomplishments, their cultural artifacts, teach the kids how to make these things again, to try to keep these cultures alive.
You're preserving it in a sense,
But making it dynamic, making it vital again, too.
That's the thing, yeah, I wanted to ask you that. I mean, so here we have these cultures that are really exquisite cultures, and they're under pressure by the 21st century for sure. The world moves so fast now, and it doesn't have time to dwell on what these ancient cultures really in the South Pacific. So, is there a point in trying to bring them current in the 21st century to make them understand science and technology and all that, or what about the possibility of just leaving them to do their own culture and forgetting about trying to bring them into our highly scientific world?
Right, you make a key point there, and indeed what we like to do is have an education system there that produces graduates that have that choice, that can stop and say, no, I know enough now, I want to go back and farm taro on my island and live that life. Or no, I want to go off and become an aerospace engineer and go to Stanford. And give them that choice.
They can. I mean, they're fully capable of doing that. I've met some very bright guys from those islands.
Right, and the education systems in general aren't producing enough of them, aren't giving enough of the kids that choice, unfortunately. But no, we're not trying to say you must change other than in the sense that the world is changing. Your young people need to be aware of this. They need to know the tools that are being used today for communication with their peers around the world, for getting things done, that they need to be familiar with this, to be facile with the technology, to be technologically fluent, as they now say. Mm-hmm. And then, yes, they can choose if they want to use that technology any way they they choose to go out and fish in the lagoons, if that's what they want to do. That's absolutely a choice they should be allowed and able to make as a culture.
So PREL is there. PREL has been there for 20 years at least. PREL has done whatever it could within its model to help these island communities stay afloat, literally, and stay afloat educationally too. I remember I was so impressed years ago when I first had contact with PREL, and there were these high school graduations being done on video all around the South Pacific at the same time. So they were all graduating in multiple islands, and you can see it all here. And this was, this was at a time when we really didn't have internet connection the way we have it now. So PREL's role, how does PREL see its role right now in dealing with, the preservation, the extension, invigoration, if you will, of those cultures, plus the education of those kids?
This is a really critical time for a lot of these cultures, because of the rapid changes that they're being forced to confront, the technology in the 21st century, the rising sea levels, the changing weather patterns. How they choose to deal with these various challenges is going to shape what kind of culture there is. And so we want to work with them very much in these very collaborative partnerships. We're not trying to walk in and say, hey, you must do this or you must do that. It's much more like, how can we help you examine all of the options you have, figure out which ones are going to be best for which parts of your populations, and help advance that. How are we going to make your cultures resilient and self-sustaining so they're not dependent on a constant influx of foreign aid, but can turn around and become vibrant and give things back to the world in fair value and become part of the whole thriving economy in the 21st century.
So you have to raise consciousness to do that, because people on islands don't necessarily have a global perception of things or a future perception of things.
There are certainly a lot of people who, have relatively limited experience and exposure to the outside world, and yes, so there's some interesting challenges there. And likewise, a lot of the outside world does not have a very accurate perception of these islands, what they're like.
That's so true. That is so true. Does PREL work both sides of that street? Are you is part of your mission to explain to the people in Hawaii and the U.S. for that matter exactly what's going on over there?
Absolutely. We have staff, we call them embedded in the islands in a number of these spots. We have staff who live there, who have lived there for years and years, who are of and from and by those cultures. And we talk with them on regular bases. We get feedback about what the local situations are, what the local challenges are, and part of our mission essentially is to feed some of that information back to the U.S. government. So when we write a proposal to the National Science Foundation, we can state very clearly what the situation is, what the needs are, what the challenges they're facing today are, and it's not just sort of random information from a distant source. It's real information based on
their specific situation and their needs.
Right.
Yeah. Let's take one more break. This is Ethan Allen. He's the STEM director for PREL, Pacific Resources for Education and Learning, right here in the Pioneer Plaza building. It's a nonprofit, been doing good work all around the South Pacific for 20 years plus. You're on Think Tech Talks. We're talking about community matters. That is the entire Pacific community today. We're talking about new moves for PREL. We'll be right back. Aloha, I'm Jay Fidell for Think Tech. For nearly half a century, the Hawaiian Foreign Trade Zone, number 9, has brought the benefits of the Foreign Trade Zone program to Hawaii businesses and entrepreneurs. DBED, the Hawaii Department of Business, Economic Development and Tourism, operates Hawaii's Foreign Trade Zone program. It does so to encourage international business and economic development. The Foreign Trade Zone mission is to increase the amount of international trading activity in Hawaii, thereby providing employment opportunities for the residents of our island state. For more information, see ftz9.org. I'm Jay Fidell of Think Tech. Mahalo. Okay, we're back. We're live. We're Think Tech Talks. doing community matters. We're talking about new moves for PREL. And PREL is a nonprofit right here in the Pacific, in the Pioneer Plaza building, and it's called Pacific Resources for Education and Learning, PREL, P-R-E-L. And its director of STEM education is Ethan Allen, who sits with me now. Ethan, so you have what, hundreds of islands out there. I was in the Coast Guard, and I traveled to a lot of them in the Coast Guard, because the Coast Guard had navigation, it had supply, it had things going on in the Pacific, all over the Pacific. We followed the trail that Michener identified, every little island. And so I can appreciate to some extent, what it is. But some of them are very distant from the others. All of them are distant from Hawaii. They're different. They all have different, I shouldn't say they all, but a lot of them are very different from each other in terms of culture, economy. I mean, this is not one size fits all by any means. How do you deal with that? Who are the strong ones? Who are the weak ones? How do you adapt your services depending?
Well, again, Jay, this is why we work in collaborative partnerships with the people on each of these islands, because yes, the challenges they face in the Marshall Islands are quite different from what they face in Palau. Both have challenges, both have assets, both have resources, both have needs, but they're different. Marshalls are very low, very flat, essentially on a road very likely to disappearing within the next century. The powers that be have to come to terms with that. That probably means you make some hard decisions about where you do or do not invest in your infrastructure at some point. Whereas a place, another like Palau, or the larger islands, the COOKE state in Micronesia, are high islands, more or less like Hawaii in that sense. A good deal of upland, hillsides, mountains. Yes, they may lose some coastline when the sea level rises, but you could always just build a new road a little further inland, basically, move your populations up. There'll be changes to be made, unfortunate displacements and all, but very different level of challenges in a sense. So each place we try to look at and think about, what do they bring to the table? What are their assets that they bring? What are their strengths? What are their resources? And then, yes, what do they need? And how can we best help them? How can we most finely tune what assistance we give them? There are basically, in the U.S. affiliated Pacific Islands, there are 11 different jurisdictions that we have to deal with different rules and regulations, and how they can get which sets of grant monies to them, which programs can serve what subsets of their populations. So there's sort of a whole logistical aspect to this whole thing too.
So part of that sounds like you're trying to help their economy. It's not just their education, but through the educational process, but also through economics, business. You're trying to help them develop 21st century economies, and thus, have a reasonable level of disposable income and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, education clearly drives economies, and so investing in education is really a very sound strategic choice. It's probably the only real choice if you want to get an economy up and running, is to have a well-educated population. So we need to do that. But in these small islands particularly, though, it's all one. I mean, they're a tiny little island like Peace Panau in COOKE. Has 300 people living on it, and they're doing everything that needs to be done on that island, and that, it's the whole population, and you can't really, on a group like that, separate out the education sector from the farming sector, from the fishing sector, from the building sector. I mean, they're all part and parcel. So sometimes those lines blur.
Yeah. Well, Hawaii is an island, so Hawaii has certain issues. We don't have manufacturing to speak of. We have to ship in all this stuff, from food to electronics, and that affects our economy. It costs us more because we wind up paying for the additional cost of shipping. But these small islands have the same process in spades. And how do they make the money that is necessary to ship everything in that way?
Well, exactly. They face far worse problems.
Yeah.
And as in Hawaii, there are moves towards trying to make Hawaii more self-sustaining and
Yeah.
develop more of our own supplies here and not have to spend all the money shipping stuff in and out.
Yeah.
Similarly, in these more remote islands, they're working the same ideas. For instance, in this project that I run called Water for Life, we try to provide clean, high-quality drinking water in these communities through educating communities about how to catch water, how to store their water. And yes, one option would be to bring in fancy UV purifiers and all, but you bring in a thing like that, and if there's no power, it doesn't work. Or if one little part breaks, that equipment's going to
Not really
sit there
practical.
and not do anything for a year or 2 years until it rusts and falls apart. So we keep looking for the very sort of low-key, rugged, sort of context and place appropriate technologies. So in this case, it's things like, well, solar distillation or solar pasteurization, where you literally can put water out in a bottle, put it in the sun on a dark surface, and it'll heat up enough to kill off any bacteria in it after a relatively few minutes.
It's an elegant solution, actually.
Relatively simple, right? Yeah, it requires really very little in the way of fancy stuff. Nice and robust. It should always last. So yeah, and at the same time, we keep our eyes on things like the nanotech world, because they're developing better filters all the time that are more robust, more long-lasting, that may soon be able to take salt water and filter the salt out and give you fresh water quite quickly, in which case suddenly the whole water issue is a very different game if you can do that.
So this is the ultimate study in sustainability. I mean, because it's really critical in an island, a small island like
Oh
that.
yeah, these small islands there's no place to go on them. I mean, there's no place to run. There's no backup. Your nearest help may be a 4 to 6 to 10 day boat ride away, and yeah, some of them are facing very tough times.
What kinds of jobs are available to somebody who chooses to stay in some of these South Pacific islands? I guess it's different from island to island, but can you give me a smattering?
Well, again, I mean, there are the basic, sort of agricultural, marine resources kinds of jobs that have always been, people have always fished and farmed. You've always got people who sell that on the marketplace, but more and more now you do see other things. So there's FSM Telecom now has a nice building, and they have their techs where they're providing cable service and internet service to the hotels, to the residences, the schools. There are, a variety of different businesses. They're trying to make and market some of their own products now. Copra is coming back, basically.
Copra's coming back.
They're trying to see, and
That's a long time ago.
Yeah, but it's a sort of useful product, and if you can produce it and market it and find a way to make money off of it, that's a fine way to move ahead. And of course, there's always groups looking to want to do mining operations, and
Be careful that you don't mine your whole island out of existence.
Exactly, that has been done.
I
in
know
some
the
cases.
Guano Island there, I forget
Down in the South Pacific, right?
South Pacific. Yeah, but what about tourism? For a time, and maybe there was a blush of it when Michener wrote his book, which was during or after the war, and thereafter, maybe in the Vietnam time, I had the feeling that there were a lot of people who wanted to visit the South Pacific Islands. I don't know how that is today, though.
They're doing more and more of it. Yeah, there's been talk, for instance, of putting in a big new hotel complex in Yap, but there's whole issues there, given their water situation. Putting in a hotel with its grounds and its needs for laundries and all that, it was going to sort of drink up a tremendous amount of the water.
Yeah.
Is that a sound strategic investment? But people are trying more and more to do that. The places promote their local things. In COOKE, they promote diving in the lagoon. There are 27 downed
Supposed to be
Japanese
really
ships
beautiful.
in this lagoon. And Palau has absolutely gorgeous, clear waters with manta rays that come to certain spots and feed regularly, and so you can dive with those. And so places are trying to promote their interesting local spots. There are very ancient ruins on Pohnpei, a culture who centuries ago built islands on top of coral flats, basically using huge basalt columns, hexagonal basalt crystals, basically, and built these islands up quite high. And how they did it, they moved them many miles in some cases, and how that happened, who organized it, for what purpose. It's very mysterious. And again, it draws tourists to come and see this stuff and think about it, and that supports the economy, of course, too. So.
Yeah. Well, I think as the world gets more complex, and Coney Island, and sort of offensive, aggressive, oppressive. The world is oppressive in some of these big population centers. Sure, you can get what you want, but you don't get the North Woods. You don't get Walden Pond. You don't get the quiet, and that's, I think, a point that will distinguish the Pacific Islands. That after a while, it may be the only place where you can have a moment of peace.
Absolutely.
And remoteness. Remoteness is a good thing. Remoteness is becoming extinct in this world, so they have a valuable asset there.
Very good point. Yes, indeed.
Anyway, that's Ethan Allen. He's the STEM director of PREL, Pacific Resources for Education and Learning. You're watching Think Tech Talks Community Matters, and we're talking about new moves for PREL, especially in the South Pacific Islands. We'll be right back after this break.
I'm Hong Jiang, host for Asia in Review on Tuesdays.
And I'm David Day, host for Asian Review on Thursdays. Both of us broadcast our respective shows at 4 p.m.
And my topics tend to deal with questions related to environment, culture, history, and sometimes human rights.
And my shows tend to be on international business, foreign policy, geopolitics, and national security. And you can watch our shows live on the ThinkTech website at thinktechhawaii.com.
And you can also watch us on YouTube or Olalo.
So come join us on Thursdays at 4 p.m. I'm David Day.
And on Tuesdays at 4 p.m., I'm Hong Jiang.
Aloha.
Aloha.
Okay, we're back. We're live. We're at Think Tech Talks Community Matters. We're talking about new moves for PREL, the Pacific Resources for Education and Learning organization here in Pioneer Plaza. And we have Ethan Allen with us. He is the Director of STEM Education for PREL. And we'll be talking about what PREL does in the South Pacific and how it does it and what it finds out there. It's a huge area, huge questions, important sustainability issues that Hawaii can learn from, what you find out there. So I was going to ask you about, PREL. With these challenges, it must be difficult, a lot of travel, a lot of difficult questions to answer, and a lot of islands that really don't have a future over time. Tell me about the challenges to PREL. How's your funding going? Where do you get your funding? How do you assure you're going to continue to get funding? What's your business model?
So our funding comes primarily from sort of two general classes. Parts of what we do are done on contract bases with entities from the islands we serve, whether that's Hawaii or the foreign islands. So we set up contracts. They come to us and say, we need some assistance in this education aspect or that education aspect, and we want these services, and we have this much money, and we set up a contract to do that. Other money comes in through grants, basically. So we write grant proposals to often federal agencies, some state agencies, some private agencies, and we're constantly trying to expand our ability to do that. It's trying to bring our indirect rate down, which will mean we can apply to more places. And that's a brutally competitive game these days. We're sort of disadvantaged in one, yes, we're sort of out in the middle of nowhere. People on the mainland tend to forget about Hawaii and much less the other islands. Yeah. They're very small populations. You can't claim they're going to serve 20 million people. There just aren't 20 million people you can serve. Your costs for providing service are huge because, yes, you have to jump on a plane and fly 5 hours to begin to serve anyone out in those islands. So yes, there are challenges. We're trying to bring technology to bear on these challenges so we can do more of our work via distance learning technologies. We hold meetings with our staff and with groups on these islands via Skype now and various web conferencing technologies. So we're constantly searching for better ways to do that service. And also trying to constantly educate the people in Washington about, yes, this is important stuff. These are critical islands. Even though there aren't a ton of people on them, they are important. The work we do is vital there, and we've been quite successful at doing that.
Good. Do you have any champions in Congress? that you can talk about.
Well, of course, we had Hawaii Senator anyway. It was a tremendous.
I'm sure.
And his loss will be felt, I'm sure, for decades here. So that was a shame. But we do try to make our friends as broadly as we can. You never quite know where they're going to come from. National Science Foundation, for example, has some of its staff assigned to be sort of look at the Pacific and islands and keep that as an interest area for them, and they want to see that they get the proper representation and the proper grants go to those areas. So we try to make sure these people know who PREL is and know what we do and appreciate the fact that we try to do good work.
Well, I think you're doing good work, and we need to have you continue doing that good work. You are the conscience of America, essentially, out there. And if you weren't doing it, gee, I hate to think of what would happen.
It's true, as you were observing during one of our breaks, that there aren't a lot of agencies that serve the islands as broadly and as thoroughly as PREL does, where we deal with everything from the states to the territories to the freely associated states, and look at all those, because we are all relatively remote Pacific Islands, we do share sets of common issues and challenges. And yeah, so I think PREL does have a unique niche to fulfill. That's one of the things we keep sort of looking inward and trying to redefine or rediscover how can we best be of the Pacific, by the Pacific, for the Pacific.
Yeah, but you know what? You're actually doing work that the government would have to do. You know, you're an NGO that is doing work that if you didn't exist, I think the government would have, and the government wouldn't be able to do it as well, because that's not really what the government can do. But the reality is the United States is interested in making sure that what you do continues. I think it's very clear from a humanitarian point of view, an ethical point of view, a territorial point of view, and every point of view. You've got to continue doing it, and I hope they understand that in going forward in Congress, where they have trouble making financial decisions.
Yes, indeed.
I wanted to ask you about we only have a minute or two left, but it just occurred to me that one of the critical things for people living on islands everywhere is medical care, because it's not, it's hard there's no economies of scale in having a sophisticated hospital in an island with 300 people. It doesn't work. On the other hand, moving those people around to a medical facility that will give them care is expensive. So how does it work?
Well, we partner, for instance, on some projects with a group called PAHOA, the Pacific Island Officers Health Association, and they face this exact challenge. How do you best provide the best medical care to this very diverse population, and try to site your hospitals as well as you can, equip them as best you can, get clinics wherever you can put a small clinic, where there's enough people to warrant it, and then figure out the transportation for people who live in the truly remote areas. So yes, actually it's very similar in some sense to the same challenges that we face in education, but with a more sort of higher level of urgency to it, because yes.
Sure, it's immediate.
Right.
Yeah.
But very similar. It ties again into the whole community well-being, self-sustainability issue too. So yes, we work closely with the public health people in these areas, and are going to, again, my water project, having clean drinking water clearly has health impacts right away on people.
Sure. So the preventative is what that is.
Yeah.
So okay, so here we are, we're delivering science education, STEM education, trying to bring these islands into a place where they at least know their options, and the kids know their options of having scientific careers, and where they, you can help them with sustainability and their community and economics. I guess my final question to you, Ethan, is how do they feel about this? What kind of feedback do you get from the people? What kind of political feedback do you get from the people on these Pacific Islands? I mean, do they have parades in your honor? When you come to town, do they throw garlands of flowers over you? Do they appreciate it? And if so, how do they express it?
We have great partners in the islands. We have wonderful partnerships, and yes, many people there do recognize that PREL has been doing incredibly valuable work for many years. And sometimes we get caught up in some political issues, because politics, you can't get away from it, but we try to sort of steer clear of that and keep the good of the populations in mind, and just always want to work with the people for their well-being. Many of the communities, are very, very happy to see us. Of course, the peoples in the Pacific, across the Pacific, are incredibly polite, charming people. I've been struck in Hawaii when you go to Hawaiian immersion schools, and all the students come out and formally greet you and welcome you with a welcoming chant. That's very. I never saw that on the mainland. Well, Chicago, the kids didn't do that at school. Right.
Yeah.
So it's very nice, and it is nice to be appreciated, and see the people do value our work.
Well, I think everyone should appreciate you, Ethan.
Well, thank you, Jay.
And PREL. I mean, I think it's very important what you do, and you're sort of taking care of something that must be handled. It's almost, I hate to say this, but this is totally eleemosynary in the fullest sense of the word, and that you're really doing good work, and you'll be rewarded for this in some way, somehow. I know you will.
Well, thank you, Jay. I think your think tech situation here is equally doing good work. It's helping promote and raise the awareness of these same kind of needs. So it's all part of the same fabric, I think.
Well, it's been great talking with you, Ethan.
Well, I've enjoyed it. Thank you very much for having me on.
Thank you. Ethan Allen, he's the STEM Education Director for PREL, Pacific Resources for Education and Learning, right here in Pioneer Plaza. And you're listening to Think Tech Talks on community matters, including this specific community. We're talking about new moves for PREL. Looking forward to having you on again, Ethan.
Excellent. I look forward to that.
Aloha.